Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's hearing. Today we're going to hear evidence from another official in what was the Department for Communities and Local Government, now the Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities. Yes, Ms. Green.
Yes, thank you. Could we have Mr. Richard Harral, please?
Good morning, Mr. Harral.
Good morning.
I understand you're going to make the affirmation.
Yes, I am.
The words should be on the screen in front of you. Would you read them out, please?
Thank you. I do solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much. Now, please sit down and make yourself comfortable. Yes, Ms. Grange, when you're ready.
Yes, thank you. Yes, thank you very much for attending to give your evidence today. It is very much appreciated. If you have any difficulty understanding any of the questions that I'm going to put to you, please just ask me to repeat the question or I'll put the point in a different way. If you feel you need a break at any point, just please let us know. And try and keep your voice up so that the lady who's transcribing your evidence sitting to your right can take a clear note of your evidence. Now, you've made one witness statement to the inquiry. If we could turn that up at CLG 3019487. There's your witness statement. And if we look at page 43, we can see it's dated the 16th of November 2018. And is that your signature?
It is.
And have you read that statement recently?
I have.
And are the contents of it true?
They are.
And have you discussed the evidence that you're going to give today with anyone before coming here?
Only my legal counsel.
Okay. Now, I'm going to start with some questions in relation to your experience and background. If we look at the first page of your witness statement again, and we look there at paragraph 2, you tell us, you say, I am a registered architect who worked in private and local authority practice for 10 years prior to joining the Building Regulations Division in the Department for Communities and Local Government, DCLG, in October 2007. And you go on to tell us that at that time, i.e. when you joined, you say, I held policy responsibility for Part K, protection from falling, collision and impact, Part M, access to and use of buildings, and Part N, glazing safety of the building regulations. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Now, just help us, thinking back to your time, you tell us you worked in private and local authority practice as an architect for 10 years prior to joining DCLG. What qualifications did you hold prior to working for DCLG?
I had a degree in architectural studies, a diploma in architecture, and I was a registered and chartered architect at that time.
Yeah. And just tell us a little bit more about your private and local authority practice. What did that entail?
So I started out in local authorities in the northwest of England, mainly working on maintenance and extension works to schools and local authority buildings at a relatively small scale. I then moved to London and worked in, I think, 2 different private practices, primarily on relatively small scale buildings, but in the range of £2 to £3 million budgets, mixture of some mixed use residential, some office, quite a lot of domestic residential work. I then ran my own practice for 3 years before deciding to join the department.
Right, yes. And in your practice as an architect, were you ever involved in the design or refurbishment of high-rise buildings?
No, I was not.
In these roles, did you ever gain any experience in relation to fire safety issues?
Or wherever we did building work that needed to comply, we would be looking at the relevant fire safety building regulations.
Yeah. So you were applying them and applying Part B in the work you were doing?
Yeah.
Did you ever do any other specialist work in relation to fire?
No, I did not.
No. Now, you go on to tell us in the next paragraph paragraph 3, you tell us there, I took over as head of technical policy in the Building Regulations and Standards Division in January 2014, overseeing a team of technical specialists and generalist civil servants with responsibility for managing building regulations technical policy, alongside various other policy responsibilities set out later in this statement. Now, it's right, isn't it, that prior to taking up that role as head of technical policy, you'd only had responsibility for parts K, M and N of the building regulations, and you hadn't had any involvement in relation to part B. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And can you just explain your role as a grade 7 principal architect? What had that involved in the department?
So I should clarify that principal was a grade. So the job title was a grade name rather than being equivalent to chief planner or anything of that nature.
Yeah.
The role involved overseeing the maintenance and development of parts K, M and N. That included stakeholder engagement, attending British standards and other committees relevant to those standards when they were working on the standards that were included in those parts of the regulations, and providing advice, briefing, etc. to ministers, responding to parliamentary questions and parliamentary business.
Yeah. Right, thank you. And so then from January 2014, and is this right, until you left the civil service in 2017, you were head of technical policy, yes?
That's correct, yes.
And in short, why did you leave the civil service in 2017?
I decided to leave the civil service because it was making me ill. The role was making me ill. I was ill twice in 2016, largely stress-related and exhaustion-related problems. I had got to a point where I had to recognise that I couldn't achieve what I wanted to achieve, and that the anxiety and frustration of not being able to actually move things forward was essentially, I remember very clearly realising it was going to kill me if I stayed.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Now, it's right, isn't it, that you took over from Anthony Bird, who had the role of head of technical policy before you. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And you explain, we don't need to go to it, at paragraph 38 of your statement on page 12, that you were progressively copied into information as part of a handover process. Is that right?
That's correct.
Did that handover start before January 2014, when you formally assumed the role?
Yeah, it would have been in probably the 6 weeks prior to the end of 2013.
Yes. And did you spend time with Anthony Bird, catching up on what the role was going to entail and being
Yes.
taught by him what it was going to entail?
The handover was briefer than that, to be honest. It was very much about working through the various portfolio elements and passing on briefing and tasks. I think I understood I'd worked for 6 and a bit years under a grade 6. I had a relatively good idea of what the job involved by that point in time.
Yeah. So when you say the handover was briefer than that, give us an idea of how long the handover lasted.
I think we had 2 or 3 meetings.
Right.
That would be an hour, hour and a half, maybe 2 hours.
Yeah. Were you given any training as part of the handover process, i.e. to bring you up to speed with, for example, parts of the building regulations which you hadn't previously been familiar with?
No.
Were you given any briefing in relation to areas of policy for which you'd not previously been responsible?
Yes, I mean, these handover meetings were primarily about talking through the work package that Mr. Bird had on his desk that he was passing over to me.
Yeah. Did you feel that the handover process was adequate for you to effectively assume the new role?
At the time, yes, I did.
Right. Now, if we look at paragraph 9 of your statement on page 3, you say, as the G6, grade 6, head of technical policy, my role was to line manage a team of between 4 and 5 technical specialists within the division, undertake recruitment and put in place succession planning and retention plans, support development of specifications for and procurement of research contracts, and ensure that suitable procedures were followed to develop and implement building regulation policy. Do you see that?
Yes.
Now, just help us. You say that you're line managing a team of technical specialists. What was their role, the role of the technical specialists?
The technical specialists were a mixture of grade 7s, which was the grade below me, and SPTOs, or senior professional technical officers, who supported and usually reported to one of the grade 7s. The grade 7s were policy leads, so they had effectively the same role that I had previously in taking responsibility for the policy on specific areas of the building regulations.
Yes, I see. You say in the last 3 lines of paragraph 9 there, we can see on the page, you say the technical specialists were expected to provide an intelligent client function in interacting with expert research and industry experts and translating their expertise into policy. Do you see that?
I do.
Now, what does providing an intelligent client function mean in practical day-to-day terms?
When I joined the division in 2006, 2007, it was being restructured, and the technical team was being downsized so that there were fewer specialists covering the same scope of area, with the intention that more specialist knowledge would be contracted in as and when there were active areas of policy that required attention. Sorry, could you repeat the question? I realise I've diverged slightly.
Yes, no, I'm interested in just understanding. You've explained that the technical specialists provided this intelligent client function, i.e. interacting with expert research and industry experts and translating the expertise, I think, of the experts, yes, into policy. Is that right?
Yeah, so the point is that the department had decided at that point in time not to hold experts in every single area of policy. We did have people who were quite expert in some areas, but we didn't cover off every area with a standing expert within the department. So a lot of my role as grade 7 or grade 6 would involve actually helping to translate industry knowledge into policy or communicating policy into industry, and that's what those policy leads did.
Yes. So were those technical specialists, is it fair to say they were your eyes and ears in relation to industry and developments in industry that you needed to be aware of?
Yeah, the policy leads would they would do the vast majority of work in terms of remaining in contact with what was happening in industry and engaging with industry.
And feeding back to you important issues that were arising in industry, which you then needed to take cognizance of when you were doing your work?
Yes.
Yes. In his oral evidence, Mr. Leadsom explained, he used a term horizon scanning, and he said that was an important part of the technical team's role. Is that effectively the same thing as this intelligent client function you're describing here?
Horizon scanning is more about trying to look beyond the existing. So horizon scanning is trying to spot issues that will need attention in the future, rather than necessarily just dealing with the policy as it stands.
Yes, I see. Anticipating issues that might be around the corner, yes?
Yeah.
And again, was it the part of the technical specialists to be doing that horizon scanning, that anticipatory role?
I think, yes. I mean, the policy leads were there to inform the way that policy was developed. But what I would say is that the capacity for horizon scanning as such became increasingly limited over time.
Yes. And I asked you a little while ago, and I'm not sure I've got an answer yet, but it's not your fault, it's mine, I think. I asked you what, in practice, day to day, the specialist would be doing in order to interact with expert research and industry experts. What would that involve? Can you just give us some examples?
They may well sit on British standard committees. They will attend industry conferences. They will attend meetings convened by industry groups and interest bodies. They would communicate with people. Often the policy leads developed quite long-standing relationships with key figures in their industry. So they would have relatively open lines of communication by email, by phone. So those are the kind of primary, I think, engagement activities, unless you were within an active policy development cycle, in which case you would have formalised working groups and structures to engage with industry through consultation as well.
Yes, I see. Yes, that's very helpful. Thank you. Now, you say at paragraph 10, below that, we can see at the bottom of the page, you say the division was not expected to hold comprehensive knowledge of all aspects of the technical standards covered by the building regulations, but be able to access or procure that expertise as required. My role included identifying how best the division could develop and maintain this necessary knowledge. So I think that follows on from the description you were just giving. In relation to fire safety, who would you as the department look to access and procure expertise?
Pretty much anything to do with fire safety would go to the fire safety policy lead, who was Brian Martin during this period.
Yes, and who would he in turn be looking to provide expertise if he didn't have it?
He may well, we had formal contracts out with organisations to bring expertise in. He's, the informal networks that are built provide an access route to garnering information. Within the policy review process, when a part of the building regulations is being reviewed, it'd be normal to have not just members of the Building Regulations Advisory Committee sitting within groups, but also to second in other people from industry, recommended often by BRAC members, but also sometimes by the policy leads, to bolster the kind of breadth and depth of expertise helping to develop policy.
Yeah. And was the BRE an example of an organisation where you had, as we know, standing contracts out to give you expert advice?
Yes, it was.
Yeah. And in order to assess the information that the technical lead was being provided with and translate it into policy proposals, was it necessary for the technical specialists to have at least some degree of technical knowledge themselves?
Yes. All of the technical specialists had a reasonable amount of experience from within industry, and in most cases they had at least one area of genuine specialism. Although in my case, when I was a grade 7 as an architect, I was a generalist in many ways. Yeah.
And now you set out the responsibilities of the technical team in more detail at paragraphs 14 and 15. If we go over to page 5, bottom of page 4, actually, it starts. You say this in paragraph 14, the technical team typically found itself acting in one of two ways. Firstly, in a day-to-day business manner, answering queries or providing briefings on existing building control requirements and policies, whilst gathering evidence and intelligence relevant to policies through informal engagement with external stakeholders. And then you go on, the department did not have a formal role or powers to undertake market surveillance activities which were effectively devolved to building control bodies. Or, in addition to this, actively developing new policies which could result in changes to the building regulations and approved documents within a defined part review process. And you go on at paragraph 15, you say, when working on day-to-day business, technical policy leads were expected to deal with the full range of such business, including briefing ministers, attending ministerial engagements, supporting ministers in the House, and meeting external stakeholders. Matters of particular importance or urgency would be flagged where my assistance or attention was required. Now, I'm going to come back to that last sentence a little later in your evidence. But can you just help us, in relation to what you say at the end of paragraph 14, as we can see on the screen there, just help us, what is a part review process?
There wasn't an ongoing process for each part of the building regulation, so that's Part A, structure, Part B, fire, and the associated approved documents to be under review. So when it was decided that there was a need to make changes to that approved document, a formal review would be scoped out, agreed with ministers, and cleared quite often by right around government because there were significant other departmental interests in building regulation policy. So a part review is a formalised process by which changes to the approved documents or the building regulations would be developed.
Yeah. Now, we know that Brian Martin held the Grade 7 role of Fire Safety Policy Lead during the period from June 2011 to November 2017, when he was promoted into a G6 role. Is that right?
That's correct.
And he was promoted into your job when you left in November 2017. Is that right?
That's correct.
And is it right that Brian Martin would be in turn supported by a number of other officials known as senior technical officers or senior technical policy officers?
In which role? His role as a Grade 7?
Yes.
So they were known, so senior executive officers were career civil servants without a technical background typically. SPTOs were senior professional technical officers, which was the same grade as an SEO but with a technical background.
Yes. And was he supported by such people in his role?
At times. Certainly, I think for most of that time there was support from an SEO. But we lost the SPTO who had been supporting, actually at that time when I was a Grade 7, just before I became a Grade 6, supporting both myself and Mr. Martin across our portfolios. He left to go into private practice, and we found it exceedingly difficult to then recruit SPTOs back into the department. We'd managed to recruit in 2008-9, I think, effectively, because the market was flat. We found it impossible to recruit at SPTO level over time. So those roles became phased out in effect, so that by probably March 2016, there was 5 Grade 7s instead of, we started with 4 Grade 7s and 4 SPTOs in 2010.
Yes, you go from 8 down to 5, I think. Is that right?
That's right, yeah. But it's the SPTO roles were impossible to recruit into. You couldn't find or attract candidates who had the right skills to come into government. So effectively, yes, for a period there would have been SPTOs, but they were effectively becoming phased out. Yeah.
And can you just elaborate on why it was so difficult to recruit those technical specialists into government at the time?
Because two things, I think. Salaries were not particularly competitive as time went on. The market was desperate for technical people, and they were at a premium. We couldn't attract people with the right skill sets and depth or breadth of knowledge at the salary levels that are being offered. The other issue is that it is a big jump to go from working in the construction industry to working in a policy department in central government. And people need really quite serious incentives. They need either a real interest or strong incentives to make that career jump. And I don't think people saw what was going on in government as really an opportunity to further their careers.
Right, thank you. Now, if we look at page 40 of your statement and look at paragraph 157, the role that you're describing there, that's Mr. Martin's role, is that right?
That's correct.
Yeah, thank you. Now, you tell us in your statement, no need to go to it, that you met as a team on a regular basis, but you also sat together as a group most days of the week, and therefore internal communication within the team was good. Is that right?
That's correct. So the arrangement of our seating changed over time. We moved buildings during this period, but normally there would be a group of desks, and the members of the technical team would be mixed with other policy officials in the division in sitting within a kind of nested group of desks that were in an open plan office.
Yeah, and just help us, who was in that nested group? So Mr. Martin presumably was in there?
Yeah, it would have been the policy officials from the rest of the division, and all of the technical officials would have been sat adjacent to each other.
Yeah.
Things did change a bit over time in terms of flexi-desking, which when we were in Marsham Street, I think probably from 2016 onwards, the department decided to maximise desk usage, and there was a requirement to have complete flexi-desking, which probably disrupted the kind of uniformity of where people sat a bit. And then there was a move to require home working. I remember, I think one day a week we were expected to work from home, so that it created more office capacity as well. And of course, within a team, that means that people are actually spending less time in the same space together.
Yeah. And was Mr. Leadsom co-located with you?
Yes.
Yeah. And just describe for us, how closely on a day-to-day basis would you work with Brian Martin?
It would vary, but it would vary entirely on whether there was an issue that we needed to work together on. So I had a very quite a lot of stretch as a grade 6 in terms of the range of areas that I was asked to contribute to. So it would be entirely case specific, dependent the amount of time that we spent working together.
Yeah. Now, it's right, isn't it, that you were his immediate superior, and you, in effect, acted as his line manager from 2014 to 2017?
That's correct, yes.
Now, in practice, what degree of oversight did you actually exercise over his work? I mean, you've said you had a heavy portfolio yourself. To what extent were you able to oversee the day-to-day work he was doing?
Day-to-day work, so grade 7s, the technical policy leads, had always had a very large degree of autonomy in terms of the day-to-day work. In many respects, it was the only way to actually cover the ground that they were asked to cover. So on day-to-day work, it would be a matter of engaging where there was a need for me to get involved, provide support, make decisions, rather than any direct oversight.
Right, yeah. And I think I might know the answer to this question, but I'm going to ask it. Did he require approval from you for everything, or was he, in practice, able to operate independently?
From 2014 to it was March 2016, where there was particular overstretch. I had agreed with Mr. Martin that he could approach Bob Leadsom directly, and for day-to-day business put up submissions without my clearance necessarily, but that was for very low priority issues. For any major issue, I would expect Mr. Martin to at least discuss that with me. Formal clearance was really actually only instigated at senior civil service level, so for submissions and other matters, they would be referred up to Bob Leadsom.
Yes, I see. And just to be clear, you in turn reported to Bob Leadsom as the Deputy Director, yes?
I did, yes.
Yeah. And is it right that throughout your time in post as Head of Technical, the official with the most detailed technical knowledge in relation to technical fire safety aspects of the building regulations and guidance was Brian Martin?
Yes.
And he had a particular focus on the building regulations relating to fire safety and the guidance in approved document B, yes?
He had, yes, that was his, I guess that was the main part of his work, but he was also deployed because we had a very limited resource base to undertake other part reviews, other reviews of approved documents, and to, he had responsibility for Part E, which is to do with noise and prevention of the passage of sound in buildings, and then ultimately as well Part Q. And this was a process that was ongoing with all of the grade 7 leads. They were going from being single subject specialists to having multiple responsibilities for different parts of the regulation.
Yeah. And Part Q was security in dwellings, is that right?
That's correct, yeah.
Yeah. Now, was there at any time any member of your technical team who had the same or a greater breadth and depth of knowledge on matters of fire safety as Brian Martin?
No, I don't believe so.
Do you recall any occasion on which any member of the technical team, or indeed you, challenged or disagreed with any information, interpretation or advice provided by Mr. Martin on any technical aspect of fire safety?
I don't recall. I'm sure that happened. There was active debate. There was a fair degree of cross-fertilisation in terms of how the different parts of the regulations interacted with each other. So Part B, which is fire safety, interacts with Part M, which is accessibility, and interacts with Part L, which is conservation of energy and power. There are interactions throughout, and there would be active debate, and but I can't remember specific instances. I do know that Mr. Martin and I disagreed on some things, but I can't remember the specifics of what they were.
Right. I understand there'd be overlap potentially and cross-fertilisation between different parts of the approved documents, but on pure matters of fire safety within approved document B, do you ever remember anybody challenging Mr. Martin in terms of his interpretation of that guidance?
I don't recall a specific instance, no.
Given your limited involvement in fire safety matters prior to becoming head of technical policy, to what extent were you in reality reliant upon his advice and expertise?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
Yeah. Given your limited involvement in fire safety matters prior to becoming head of technical policy, to what extent were you reliant on his advice and expertise on those matters?
I was reliant on all of the specialist policy leads, if you like, to a large degree when it came to the in-depth knowledge that sat behind the regulations. I had a general knowledge and understanding of the actual regulations themselves, but there is always a great deal of depth behind the requirements in the approved documents.
Right. I think it follows from that answer that you would have been heavily reliant upon him in terms of his advice and expertise in matters of fire safety, yes?
Yes.
And did you yourself feel able to depart from or challenge his advice on matters of fire safety?
Yeah, we did disagree on matters at times, and I overruled him at times as well. So yes, I did feel able to do that, but I would only do so if I had absolutely clear grounds for overruling his expert advice. And I can't remember specific instances. I know that we did disagree about matters from time to time.
Yeah. Can you just describe your professional relationship with him? How was it line managing him? We got on pretty well, I think. We were able to have very honest discussions about issues. There was no problem in terms of being able to explore issues. I think it was. Sorry, repeat the question. I'm sorry. Well, I'm asking about what your professional relationship was like with him, just in general terms.
Yeah, I think in generally it was. I think it was good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You said before that there had been occasions where you disagreed on matters. Can you
Yeah.
remember what type of issues those were?
Well, one instance would be that I overruled Mr. Martin in terms of restructuring approved document B. So Mr. Martin's view was that, so in 2015-16, and I can't remember specifically when, we were looking at the simplification process for the approved documents and Part B, following up on the Lachenal Coroner's recommendations. I was trying to create a uniformity across the approved documents, and I'm going to expand on this slightly. So historically, the different policy leads had worked with a lot in a much more siloed way. And so what you had across the approved documents were splits of approved documents or arrangements of approved documents that were inconsistent. And as part of the simplification process that I was trying to drive forward, I was trying to create uniformity that would allow us to reduce the number of decisions and the amount of thinking people needed to do to use the guidance effectively. Part B had been restructured in 2006 into dwelling houses and buildings other than dwelling houses, which a dwelling house is a house, whereas buildings other than dwelling houses are all other types of buildings. So it's simple houses or more complex buildings.
Yeah.
I think partly based on the ROBA-E user research, I instructed Mr. Martin to restructure those documents into dwellings and buildings other than dwellings, simply to ensure that people were much clearer about which guidance appeared where. So that's one example of where I overruled him.
And he didn't want to do that, why?
He didn't want to do that because there had been a very conscious decision about the split in 2006, which was to do with the complexity of the fire safety matters rather than the type of building, if that makes sense. So the split had been done on basis of complexity rather than typology, and I was requiring him to reorganise it by typology.
Right, I see. Thank you. I want to ask you now just some more questions about your own knowledge of the building regulations and approved document B. Can you give us just some idea of what your level of knowledge was in the period from when you took over in 2014 onwards, when you took over as head of technical policy?
So I felt that I was able to interpret approved document B. I understood its general structure. I understood the general principles. I would not memorise approved document B. It's a large document. It's something that you do need to refer to. But I've got, I have a generalist skill set. So my level of understanding of approved document B would be kind of comparative to a general user of the document, I would suggest.
Right, thank you. Were you familiar, for example, with the broad division of the functional requirements in Part B? So B1, B2, B3. Did you know what each of those covered?
Yes.
And were you familiar at any time between 2014 and 2017 with the specific functional requirements in B4 relating to external fire spread?
Yes.
And when did you become familiar with those requirements? Was there a particular time when you had to become more familiar with them?
Yes, if I remember correctly, there was a fire in Dubai in February 2015, which was brought to our attention. And at that time, I remember speaking to Mr. Martin and sense checking the requirements of B4 in relation to external fire spread.
Yes, I'm going to come back to those emails later in your evidence. If we could just turn to your statement for a moment, look at page 25, paragraph 92. You say work streams, this is where you're dealing with the 7 work streams, which again we'll come to. You say work stream 6 of this project included research into space separation. And then you go on and describe requirement B3 of the building regulations relates to the need to prevent fire spreading between buildings. And guidance in the approved document sets out one way in which this can be achieved. Do you see that?
That's an error.
Yes.
I'm sorry.
That's okay. That should read not B3, but...
B4.
Thank you. Yes. But that's simply a typo in your statement, yes?
Yes.
You would have known that space separation fell under requirement B4 at the time?
Yes.
Yeah. Now, were there parts of the approved document that you were more familiar with when you started your role, based on the past expertise you'd had as an architect?
It would be for less complex buildings because that was the general type of work that I had undertaken.
Yeah. So you wouldn't have ever looked at approved document B with reference to, say, a high-rise building? No,
I didn't work. Prior to joining the department, I don't recall ever working on a high-rise building.
Yeah. Let's look briefly at the approved document. If we go to CLG 1607, this is going to be the 2006 edition of the approved document, which was in force from the 6th of April 2007. If we go over to page 93, we can see functional requirement B4 set out there. And we can see that it reads, the external walls of the building shall adequately resist the spread of fire over the walls and from one building to another, having regard to the height, use and position of the building. Now, did you have any clear understanding of the meaning of the phrase adequately resist the spread of fire over the walls of the building during the time that you were head of technical policy?
I don't require querying it, but I would understand why the word adequately is there.
Can you help us as to what your understanding was as to why the word adequately was there?
Well, the objective of Part B is life safety, and therefore the resistance to the spread of flame over walls would be based on the level of protection needed to achieve that aim, not absolutely to resist the spread of fire. So it's not an absolute condition. Sorry. If it said the building shall resist the spread of fire over the walls, that would be an absolute condition that would be very hard to achieve in practical terms.
Right. I see. So adequately, is this right, would need to take into account the life safety risks of any external fire spread, and adequately what would vary depending on the risks in any particular building? Is that how you understood it?
Yeah, it's about achieving the life safety protection aim at the end of that process.
Right. So does that mean that adequately resist in one tall building might mean something different from adequately resist in another tall building, depending on what other fire safety measures were present in those two buildings?
I think that's probably the case. It's a functional system of regulation. It's intended to accommodate the variety of solutions and different circumstances that occur in the built environment, which are very varied. So whilst the guidance might be uniform across a range of buildings, there's no presumption that is the only solution that could achieve that objective.
Yes, I see. Can you remember there ever being any discussion within the department about the meaning of adequately resist in requirement B4?
No, I don't recall that.
Now, if we look at page 95, to the very last paragraph in the right-hand column, at the bottom of 95, we can see the heading External Surfaces, and then paragraph 12.6, which reads, the external surfaces of walls should meet, and it goes over the page, the provisions in diagram 40. Now, this is a section of the guidance to which the inquiry is now very familiar. Were you familiar with that paragraph at any time before the fire at Grenfell Tower?
Yes. I looked at it following the February 2015 fire in Dubai.
Right. And was that the only time you looked in detail at the approved document before 2017 in relation to that February 2015 Dubai fire?
I can't say for certain, but I don't recall. I really don't know.
Right. And we will come back to it and we'll look at the specific. There are some emails around this. But did you look together with Mr. Martin at these provisions at that time, or did you take an independent look yourself at the provisions?
I took an independent look myself, I think, at that time.
Right. In that period, 2014 to 2017, did you have any understanding of the term National Class Naught?
Yes.
What did you know about that classification?
That it was a surface spread of flame rating that was defined within the regulations. Or within the approved document.
Right. And were you aware, or did you become aware at a later stage, that the national classification and the European classifications were running in parallel, certainly in this bit of the approved document, so manufacturers could select between them?
Yes, I was aware of that because I had discussions with Mr. Martin. I can't recall when. I think it would be during the Part B review process, by which I mean probably 2015 to 17, probably early on, where we had a discussion about removing national classifications to simplify terminology and use of the documents.
Right. And what did you conclude when you had that discussion about removing the national classifications?
I seem to recall that we thought it was a good idea, but we didn't get into detail of the kind of equivalence of those standards. It was more a matter of, I think, time having passed since the introduction of European standards. I do recall we worried slightly about that move, given that I think it might have been around the time of the Brexit referendum, and we wondered whether moving to European standards would be appropriate.
Right, I see. Now, you say you thought it was a good idea, but we didn't get into detail at that stage. Is that right?
Yeah, it was just in principle that we should consider withdrawing the national standards and I think moving to the European standards.
Right. And was there a piece of work that you thought would consider that question in more detail?
Yeah, it would have been the Part B review.
And when you say the Part B review, do you mean the Part B technical review?
Yes.
Right. So it was your understanding that the Part B technical review would include asking the question, should we get rid of the national classifications in approved document B?
That certainly, yeah, as far as I can recall, I think that was a consideration that we'd had discussed.
Yeah. And was that work ever done?
We didn't get to the point where we had a Part B working group sitting, so it wouldn't have actually got to that point, no.
No. Right. And did you have a clear understanding about the difference between what was tested in the national classifications and what was tested in the Euro classification system?
No, I wouldn't have understood in any detail the difference between those systems.
Did Mr. Martin ever explain to you the difference with reference to diagram 40 between national class 0 and European class B, for example?
I don't recall discussing that.
Did you know that it was effectively like comparing apples and pears? They were testing very different things.
No.
Were you ever informed that there had been an original transition period which had been envisaged for the two systems to work in parallel and then for the national classification to be phased out? Were you ever made aware of that transition period?
I can't remember a specific period being discussed, but that was the basis of the discussions I had with Mr. Martin about phasing out the national standard, I think.
Right. Did Brian Martin tell you that it had always been intended that there would be a transition period?
I don't recall.
Okay. Now, if we go to page 96, we've got it here, sorry, page 96, we then see underneath 12.6, we've got 12.7, headed insulation materials / products. And we can see that says, in a building with a story 18 metres or more above ground level, any insulation product, filler material, not including gaskets, sealants and similar, etc., used in the external wall construction should be of limited combustibility. But then it goes on to say that restriction doesn't apply to a masonry cavity wall construction. Now, can we take it you're now familiar with the content of that paragraph?
I am.
What about before the Grenfell Tower fire? Had you been familiar with that particular paragraph of the approved document when you were head of technical policy?
We looked at it I looked at it specifically in 2015.
Right. So again, the same in relation to the Dubai cladding fires.
Yeah.
Now, at that time, What was your understanding of the phrase limited combustibility? Did you have a clear understanding of what that meant?
Yes, it was, I think, an A2 classification.
Now, to what elements of the external wall construction did you understand that this limited combustibility requirement applied to?
I understood that it applied generally to the principal elements of the construction.
And what do you mean by that? Can you be clearer?
Well, the specified elements in 12.7 of I took the heading in 12.7 to mean insulation materials and products, and the application of that, I think, was therefore relevant to the products and filler materials that are specified.
Sorry, let's just unpack that a little bit. You said, I took the heading to mean insulation materials and products. And
Sorry,
the application of that, I think, was therefore relevant to the products and filler materials. Let's just break this down. Did it apply to insulation in the external wall? Did it apply to the external panels that might be used in an external wall, such as a rain screen panel?
My understanding was that the reference to filler material referenced the combustible parts of those panels, I think.
And when you say that was your understanding, did you reach that understanding simply by reading the approved document yourself, or because somebody told you that?
I had a discussion with Mr. Martin about the 2006 ADB review.
Right, I see. And he told you what the meaning of the word filler was, did he?
I don't recall.
Right. Do you remember noticing that filler was not defined anywhere within the approved document?
I didn't. No, I didn't. No.
It would be normal, though, wouldn't it, for terms to be defined clearly in the approved document? There's normally a list of definitions within any approved document, yes?
Yes, there are. Whether it is no. If it's a key term, then it should be defined.
Yeah. And when you said filler referenced the combustible parts, can you just help? What did you mean by that?
I understood that it was that there were, in the 2006 review, there were composite metal cladding panels that had been identified with combustible filler materials of various types, and that was why the reference was introduced.
Right, I see. What about the external panels themselves? Imagine if you've got like a high pressure laminate panel as your outside skin. Did that get caught by the limited combustibility requirements so far as you understood it in 2015?
I think it was captured more by the functional approach of the regulations.
Right. So if someone had come to you and said, does the exterior skin of my panel, does it need to be of limited combustibility? What would you have said in 2015 after you looked at this?
I would have looked at the guidance as a whole. I would have looked at the section as a whole, performance requirements 12.5, and looking at the other, the insulation materials and products provides a reference value for elements in the outside to make decisions about how you meet the functional requirement. I think that's the way I looked at it at the time.
Right. And did you come away, when you looked at it, with the impression that this guidance was clear?
I thought it was adequate.
What does that mean?
I thought it was... the question that we were asking at the time was whether combustible filler materials were controlled, and therefore I looked at the guidance at the time, because this is in relation to the Dubai fire. I looked at the guidance and I thought it was adequate. I thought it did control the right elements.
Okay. Well, as I say, we will come back to this with specific reference to the emails that were exchanged on this topic. Just finally on approved document B, what about the BS 8414 test series and the criterion BR 135? Did you have any knowledge about that kind of large-scale fire testing?
Not in detail, no.
Right. Now, I want to move on now to ask you some questions about deregulatory policies.
Yeah.
And you've covered these in quite a lot of detail in your witness statement. And you particularly describe the effect of deregulation and its effect on the department's work in your statement. If we look at paragraph 25 of your statement on page 8, you say government policy prior to 2010 had focused on better regulation, typically consisting of setting a higher bar for the introduction of new regulations in order to discourage their use. My understanding being that the overuse of regulations in this period was seen as a drag on economic performance. Do you see that?
Yeah.
And then you go on in the next paragraph to say, at paragraph 26, you say the coalition government and the subsequent government from May 2015 onwards, so that was the Conservative government, adopted a far more vigorous approach to deregulation with increased scrutiny of regulatory proposals through a range of policies, including at various times. And then you've given us a list of those different policies. Now, you talk about a far more vigorous approach to deregulation. Was that very evident at the time to all of you working within the department, that there was suddenly a much more aggressive approach to deregulation in that period?
It was very tangible. Yes. The general appetite for deregulation was manifested in a range of ways, in terms of the red tape challenge, in terms of the establishment of the Regulatory Policy Committee, a series of policies, one in, one out, so on and so forth. So that impact was absolutely evident, and discussions with ministers reinforced that.
Right. Give us a flavour of what those discussions were that reinforced it.
Well, there was just the general, there was a general sense that regulation was bad, and even where there were proposals to do something that was regulatory, in terms of introducing something that was attractive to ministers, or something they might want to do, when they recognised that it was regulation, they would pull back from that generally, because that was not the way that they preferred to drive change.
Right. Can you recall any specific experiences where you had that pushback? Can you give us any specific examples of that?
Not from, well, I remember one discussion with Nick Bowles as a planning minister on space standards, where precisely that discussion happened. He was quite enthusiastic about space standards, but then I recall he said, but that's regulation, we shouldn't be doing that. There were regular challenges from the better regulation unit within the department in particular. I remember clearly at the end of 2016 being told by an official from the better regulation unit not to consider proposing regulation, in terms of because the department was struggling with its regulatory budgets, so effectively told don't propose any new regulation. Those challenges were fairly consistent, and the actual process was fundamentally challenging in terms of the justifications that were needed for new regulation.
Right, yes. Now, we can see then that you've listed out a number of different policies in the remainder of paragraph 26, including at A there, the introduction of the 1 in, 2 out policies, requiring that twice the cost of any new regulatory burden be removed from the stock of regulation prior to any new regulation being introduced. And this increased to 1 in, 3 out in early 2016, is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
And 1 in, 2 out came in 2013, is that right?
Yes, I believe so.
And is it right that that built on the earlier policy of one in, one out, introduced in January 2011?
Yes.
Now, just help us with this. At the time, was it your understanding that one in, one out, or one in, two out, or one in, three out applied to guidance given in relation to the building regulations, such as guidance in the approved documents?
Yes, absolutely.
Did you ever take advice as to whether the policy did in fact extend to approved documents, where they were simply giving a possible route to compliance, but you could adopt an alternative route if you wanted to?
We had the Better Regulation Unit within the department were there to advise and police regulatory policy, and we had regular discussions with them. And it was very clear that the statutory guidance was captured by requirements to undertake impact assessment work.
And when you say it was very clear, is that because that's what they told you?
In part, but we simply couldn't progress work without going through that process.
Right. Do you ever recall a conversation with anyone where someone said, well, this is just one alternative route to compliance, it's just suggestions about how you could comply in the approved document, and failure to comply with it doesn't necessarily mean you're in breach of the building regulations, so does it bite on the policy or not? Do you ever remember having that discussion?
I think we talked about, we were frustrated by the depth and challenge of regulatory policy, and the bar and the examination of policy got greater and greater over time. And so we often talked about whether it was rational for statutory guidance to be controlled in that way. But essentially it set a benchmark minimum, and that's what was being measured. But no, I don't remember us challenging that.
Right. Yes, or seeking legal advice on it.
No, it's impact assessment work, and the requirement for the statutory guidance to be impact assessed had been in place for decades.
Yes, yes. Let's just look at a couple of pieces of guidance relevant to one in, one out, and one in, two out. I want to start with the one in, one out. I know that was before you became head of technical policy, but you'll see why I want to go to this. If you go to INQ 30151131, this is the one in, one out methodology, and it's dated July 2011. And if we turn on to page 4, I just want to look at the part which it says, what is in scope of one in, one out? Do you see that there at paragraph 13?
Yeah.
And it says, for the purposes of one in, one out, regulation is defined as a rule or guidance with which failure to comply would result in the regulated entity or person coming into conflict with the law or being ineligible for continued funding, grants and other applied for schemes. This can be summarised as all measures with legal force imposed by central government and other schemes operated by central government. Now, do you remember ever looking at this guidance?
No.
No. But if just focusing on that first part of it, a rule or guidance with which failure to comply would result in the regulated entity or person coming into conflict with the law. Now, just looking at that now, was it your understanding that failure to comply with approved document B would result in a person coming into conflict with the law?
Yes, I believe so.
And why? Why do you say that?
Part B is a legal regulatory requirement which can result in criminal prosecution if you don't comply.
I understand that about the functional requirement, Part B, and that if you fail to meet the functional requirement, you're coming into conflict with the law. But if you're just failing to follow a paragraph of guidance within the approved document, How does that bring you into conflict with the law? I'm just interested as to whether that was ever thought about.
No. Essentially, the application of this was no. Basically, I don't recall looking at that.
No. If we go to 1 in, 2 out, there's a piece of 2015 guidance that helpfully summarises that. It says INQ 30151132. This is called the Better Regulation Framework Manual, Practical Guidance for UK Government Officials, March 2015. And if we go to page 8 within it, there's guidance there, 1.1, Reducing Regulation Subcommittee. There's something called the Reducing Regulation Cabinet Subcommittee, the RRC, yes?
Yeah.
And later in this document, you can take it from me that it says 1 in, 2 out applies to any changes which require clearance from the Reducing Regulation Committee, the RRC. And if you look at paragraphs below that, we've got scope. Do you see that?
Yes.
And it says at 1.1.3, if your measure requires collective agreement and if it regulates or deregulates business, then you must seek clearance from the RRC. And then below that, at 1.1.4, it says measures in scope can take different legal forms, including, and then you've got third bullet point, guidance issued under statutory powers. Do you see that there?
Yes.
So it seems to be potentially a different test being posed in this piece of guidance about 1 in, 2 out. Do you ever being aware that there were different tests under the different pieces of guidance, 1 in, 1 out, 1 in, 2 out?
No.
And then if we look at paragraph 1.1.8 on page 9, we can see that it says there, 1.1.9, measures that qualify for the fast track also require RRC clearance. However, they may be eligible for a streamlined clearance process that removes the need for final stage clearance under certain conditions. Sorry, actually, I meant to read the paragraph above. Go to 1.1.8, the paragraph above. It says, if a measure is considered trivial or mechanical, for example, where errors in a previous measure are being corrected in line with the original policy intent, it may not require collective agreement. Do you see that?
Yes.
Now, was it your understanding that if you were merely clarifying or correcting something, for example, in guidance like Approved Document B, that these deregulatory policies would bite on that clarification?
If it involved amending guidance in the if it involved amending the statutory guidance so that the minimum recommended standard was changed, then it would definitely bite. But whether it was applicable to other mechanisms such as FAQs or other ways to provide greater clarity, I wouldn't. I wasn't aware of this paragraph at the time. I think that. Sorry, could you repeat the question again, please?
Well, let me put it this way. We know that at various times between 2014 and 2017, you were looking to clarify the guidance in Approved Document B, yes?
Yes.
Or simplify the guidance in Approved Document B,
Yeah.
yes? And the difference may be important. We'll come back to that. If you were just clarifying or simplifying, was it your understanding that these policies would bite on that?
Yes, because when you issued an updated approved document, there was a cost to industry in familiarising itself with the revised document, and that was captured by the impact assessment process.
Gosh, so simply the cost associated with looking at a revised, simplified, approved document,
Yeah.
that was deemed to be a cost to industry,
Yes.
even though the substantive requirements had not changed.
Sorry, I should correct myself. It might be regarded as a benefit to industry if the savings from the clarification were greater than the cost of the time taken to familiarise yourself, but it would be subject to impact assessment work on that basis. Part K of the building regulations was subject to a simplification exercise in 2010 to 12, which is very much along these lines. The guidance was not in itself changed, but it was still subject to impact assessment requirements.
Right. Let's take another example. Take the word filler, and suppose you had decided to clarify what the word filler meant. You weren't changing the original intent of that word, but you were just clarifying it with a definition of what it meant. Would that, on your understanding of these policies, have engaged them?
It would, if it was just a clarification, then I would imagine no. But if it was seen as a change, then yes.
Right. I think I understand. Did you ever give active consideration in the period 2014 to 2017 to whether some of the work that you wanted to do on Approved Document B was clarificatory work which didn't engage these deregulatory policies?
No, I can't say that I did.
So is it fair to say that during that period you all simply assumed that these deregulatory policies were biting on any work you were doing, whether it was simplification, clarification, or changing substantive requirements?
Anything that involved amendment or change to the approved document essentially triggered impact assessment work as far as I understood.
Right. Now, thinking about 1 in, 2 out, and then 1 in, 3 out, was it your understanding that it was possible to obtain an exemption for the policy for certain regulations or types of regulations?
I didn't understand that option was available to us at any stage. I think that there may have been an exemption for the regulation of scrap metal dealing on national security grounds, but our functions and the work that we oversaw, I did not understand that there was an option for any exemption.
Right. At any time between 2014 and 2017, did you or anyone else within the department ever consider applying for an exemption for parts of the building regulations from the policy? For example, those that were concerned with life safety?
No.
And why not? Why no consideration ever to whether there could be an exemption for life safety parts of the building regulations?
I think probably 70% of the building regulations relate to life safety. And that's true across regulation, across a large swathe of the government stock of regulation as well. They relate to safety or health and safety. And I think there was a kind of understanding that part of the reason for introducing these measures was to curtail the growth of curtail or ensure that there was a robust case for expanding these types of regulations.
So is it fair, is what you're saying, that actually it was fully envisaged that these deregulatory policies would be impacting on parts of the building regulations which were concerned with life safety?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Yes. Is it fair to say that what was envisaged was that these deregulatory policies would be impacting on parts of the building regulations which were concerned with life safety?
Yes.
Yes. And can you just help us, what counted as one regulation for this purpose? I know it's got a very technical definition in the documents, but in terms of your working rule of thumb, what would you count as one regulation for the purposes of 1 in, 2 out?
It was a financial consideration, so you would evaluate the cost difference between the existing requirements and you have a counterfactual case, quite a complex piece of economic analysis that would look at the difference between, the counterfactual would state the current cost and then you would measure the new cost against that or saving if you were in deregulatory assessments.
Yes, I see. Now, at paragraph 30 of your statement, if we go to page 10 of it, you say that the government was also proactive in forcing departments to focus on deregulation through initiatives such as the 2011 Red Tape Challenge that included a Red Tape Challenge on construction in 2012. The basis of the Red Tape Challenge was that regulations should only be retained if they could be justified as being absolutely necessary. The division was closely engaged in the construction Red Tape Challenge in the 2012 to 13 period, and the subsequent work on the housing standards review was also carried out under the aegis of this policy. Essential safety measures were exempted from this process. Now, just to be clear, where you say in that last line, essential safety measures were exempted from this process, do you mean exempted from the housing standards review that you deal with in the penultimate line there, or do you mean exempted from the Red Tape Challenge more generally?
It was their specific exemption, I think, from the housing standards review.
Right, yes. And which essential safety measures were exempted from that housing standards review? What was your understanding about that?
I don't recall the specific wording that was used to describe that. But the housing standards review related to a series of standards that were primarily imposed through planning processes. And it focused on, I don't recall any of those touching on life safety issues particularly.
Right. Were you aware that the Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order 2005 was explicitly excluded from this Red Tape Challenge process by ministers in 2012?
I don't recall.
You don't remember being aware of that?
In 2012, I would have not been engaged across policy areas to the extent that I was later on.
Right, I see. Yeah. So you can't help us as to why it was that the Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order 2005 was determined to be exempt from this Red Tape Challenge?
I mean, I've seen documents since, I think, relating to it, but I wasn't involved and I had no part in that decision or at the time.
I see. Were you aware, when you became head of technical policy, that it was possible to obtain an exemption for certain regulations from the Red Tape Challenge process?
I don't recall.
And did you or anyone else within the department ever consider applying for an exemption for the building regulations from the Red Tape Challenge process?
No, I don't. So the Red Tape Challenge on building regulations took place kind of 2012 onwards, I think.
Yes, we think it ran till 2014, which is why I'm asking you about it.
I don't recall any discussions about seeking an exemption for the building regulations as a whole. No.
Right, okay, thank you. Mr Chairman, I think I'm about to move to another subtopic, so
Yes.
that would be a good moment for the break.
Right. Well, Mr. Harral, we have a break during the morning and the afternoon, and this is a good time to take the morning break. So we'll stop at that point. We'll resume, please, at 25 to 12. And now you've started to give your evidence, I have to ask you, please, not to talk about your evidence or anything relating to it when you're out of the room.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. Would you go with the usher, please? Thank you very much. 25 to 12, please. Would you ask Mr. Harral to come back in, please? Okay. All right, Mr. Harral, ready to carry on?
I am.
Thank you very much. Yes.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I want to ask you some questions now about the review process for reviewing, for example, documents like approved document B. You explain the review process for regulatory requirements or approved documents at paragraph 17 of your statement on page 5. If we could go to that. You say this at 17, decisions on changes to regulatory requirements in the building regulations or to the supporting statutory guidance in the approved documents could only be made through a formal review process. A formal review process involved developing the initial case and advice for ministers which set out the scope and need for the review, policy development in collaboration with an industry working group, commissioning research as necessary to develop or assess technical proposals, development of impact assessments, full public consultation, preparing draft of the approved documents, working with lawyers on any necessary changes to primary or secondary legislation, finalising impact assessments and implementing change. Depending on the scope and complexity of changes and how much new research was needed to underpin policy development, this process could take anything between 18 months and 4 years to complete. So you explain that there. Now, that formal review process, is this right, relates to changes to the requirements or guidance, yes?
Yes.
What was the process if it was felt that the existing requirements or guidance did not need to change but needed clarification?
You would seek legal advice as to whether it was a change or a clarification, and that would determine whether you could issue possibly an FAQ or something of that nature. Potentially, I guess, an amendment slip to an approved document rather than republishing an approved document. But I don't recall actually pursuing that option at any stage.
No. We obviously know a little bit about FAQs, and we'll come back to those in more detail. When you say potentially an amendment slip to the approved document, can you describe exactly what that would be?
Well, this was the way that very minor amendments to approved documents were made, particularly when everyone had hard copy approved documents. It's just a simple page setting out what to delete or amend in an approved document and what the change is. So historically, people would keep the amendment slips in the back of the relevant approved document when they had hard copies. Right. But it's basically an instruction to amend a relatively minor part of, or a small part of an approved document. It saves the republication of the whole document. It's a way of avoiding waste in a hard in a hard copy kind of world.
And were clarifications ever brought about by way of these amendment slips?
I don't know.
Right, I see. Was there a formal process where the guidance required clarification as opposed to change, or was the process an ad hoc one depending on what the change involved?
Clarifications would not normally be done by amending the approved document, I think is the answer.
So how would they be done routinely?
Pretty much the only option was actually using an FAQ.
Right, I see, yeah.
I think.
Now, if we go back to paragraph 15, page 5 of your statement, we were looking at this before, and I said I'd come back to the last sentence of paragraph 15, which reads, matters of particular importance or urgency would be flagged where my assistance or attention was required. Was there an established process for raising such urgent issues with you?
No. It would either be done verbally, in person, or probably by email.
Right, I see. So you're just describing the practice there in terms of how the department worked, yes?
Yes.
Right. And do you ever remember matters of particular importance or urgency relating to fire safety being flagged and raised with you?
There were a number of exchanges relating to fire safety. The issue with Kingspan K15 is one example. I can't, off the top of my head, I'm sure that they were.
Right, I see, yeah. And was there a process for considering urgent or important amendments outside the formal review process that we saw you describe at paragraph 17 of your statement?
If you wanted to amend a requirement, then it went through the formal review process. Sorry, when I say a requirement, if you wanted to change the standard that was set out in statutory guidance, if you wanted to change something that was material, then that would always go through the full process as far as I was aware.
Even if it was time critical and urgent?
I wasn't aware of any exemption to that requirement once you were into actually changing technical requirements in the approved documents. It's a very slow process.
Right. So you weren't aware of any fast-track, expedited process that could be followed if, for example, someone realised that they'd put out something in an approved document and for public safety reasons that needed to be urgently clarified?
I imagine that if it's a clarification, then you could either use an FAQ or possibly a circular letter, although not for clarification purposes, but I had taken advice on using circular letters to issue corrective advice, i.e. where I thought that there was divergent from the intent of the way that the building regulations and the statutory guidance was being followed in a particular instance. And the advice I was given was that using a circular letter in that way would be limited to simply highlighting the existing wording in the approved document and the regulations. So you would not be allowed to reshape the guidance, but you could write to everyone and say, we are writing to remind you of the guidance in such and such a document which states such.
Oh, right. And what was your understanding about why you were limited in just highlighting the existing text and you couldn't put any kind of gloss or interpretation on that?
So the approved documents are the guidance approved by the Secretary of State, and you had to go through due process to make a material change, if you like, to the approved documents.
Yeah. But I think what you're saying is, aside from the clarification route, the FAQ route, or a circular letter route, there wasn't a well-understood expedited process by which urgent matters could be changed in the approved document if necessary.
There's no established process for doing that, no.
Yeah. And these circular letters, when they were sent out, who would they go to? For example, if it was a circular letter about approved document B, who would that be sent to?
I think it goes out to building control bodies and associated industry bodies for dissemination.
Right. And just to be clear, were you reliant on the technical specialists in your team to identify the need to review the guidance in the approved documents?
The technical policy leads would set out where they thought changes to the approved documents needed to be made.
Yes. You tell us in your statement that where necessary, the department would second industry experts to support policy development. And we're aware that Mr. Martin was so seconded before he joined your department. But are you aware of any other instances where industry experts were seconded in relation to fire safety while you were head of technical policy?
No, and the reason for that was that people seconded into the department counted as part of the head count for the division. So I would have needed to make a vacancy to second someone in, and that did not occur.
Right, I see. I understand. I want to turn to some questions now about the Lachenal House fire inquest. So we know that the Lachenal House fire occurred on the 3rd of July 2009. It was a tower block cladding fire in Camberwell, London, in which 6 people died. And the inquest into that fire took place between the 14th of January and the 28th of March 2013. Did you have any awareness of the Lachenal House fire prior to coming into your role as head of technical policy?
Yes, I was aware of the inquest as it was progressing. But that was purely by the fact that members of the division were involved in the inquest process.
Right, yes. Now, you tell us, we don't need to turn up, I don't think, at paragraph 39 of your witness statement on page 12, that you say, from a very early stage in my role, I was aware of the work streams resulting from the fire at Lachenal House. Is that right?
That's correct.
And how did you come to understand each of those work streams arising from Lachenal House?
It would have been part of the handover process with Mr. Bird.
Right. And did you receive any documents in order to help you get up to speed with what the different work strands were?
I recall being given packages of documents by Mr. Bird, but I can't recall specifically whether that included documents relating to Lachenal.
Right. Do you remember ever reading the Coroner's Rule 43 letter to the department?
I can't recall.
Right. Do you ever remember reading any of the submissions that were sent to ministers in 2013? We know there was a submission to Minister Don Foster on the 11th of April 2013, and there was a submission sent to Eric Pickles about how to respond on the 13th of May 2013. Did you ever see any of those submissions?
No.
Did you ever read the letter of response to the coroner, which was prepared and sent on behalf of Mr. Pickles?
I do recall reading that, yes.
Yeah, you saw that. Now let's turn first to the Rule 43 letter sent to the department by the coroner, Her Honour Francis Kirkham. If we can go to CLG 401870. Here we've got her letter. We can see her details at the top. Sent to the Right Honourable Eric Pickles MP on the 28th of March 2013. So I think you said you don't recall. Now you've seen this. Does this provoke any recollection about whether you ever read this letter from the coroner?
I have definitely read this letter from the coroner, but I can't remember when.
Yeah. Now, the recommendation dealt with by your department relating to the building regulations and the approved document appears on page 3, if we go to that. And if we look at the first paragraph, she says, during these inquests, we examined approved document B, 2000 edition incorporating 2000 and 2002 amendments. I'm aware that ADB has subsequently been amended and believe that a further amendment is due to be published soon. The introduction to ADB states that it is intended to provide guidance for some of the more common building situations. However, ADB is a most difficult document to use. Further, it is necessary to refer to additional documents in order to find an answer to relatively straightforward questions concerning the fire protection properties of materials to be incorporated into the fabric of a building. Do you see that paragraph?
I do.
And then underneath that, she has 3 recommendations. It's recommended that your department review ADB to ensure that it, and we can see that she says, provides clear guidance in relation to Regulation B4 of the building regulations, with particular regard to the spread of fire over the external envelope of the building and the circumstances in which attention should be paid to whether the proposed work might reduce existing fire protection. The second recommendation is that it ADB should be reviewed to ensure that it is expressed in words and adopts a format which are intelligible to the wide range of people and bodies engaged in construction, maintenance and refurbishment of buildings, and not just to professionals who may already have a depth of knowledge of building regulations and building control matters. And then the third recommendation was to review ADB to ensure that it provides guidance which is of assistance to those involved in maintenance or refurbishment of older housing stock, and not only those engaged in design and construction of new buildings. So we have those three recommendations. Have you read the department's opening submissions for this module of the inquiry?
I have not.
Right. I just want to look at those. It's at CLG 3036387. So these are the opening submissions on behalf of the Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities for this module of this inquiry. And if we look on page 36, at paragraph 112, A to E, are a number of points about the Lachenal House Coroner's recommendations. And this is to be fair, this is the department's position. I just want to ask you about it. So it says at 112, having given extensive consideration to the response to the Lachenal House Coroner's recommendations issue, the department's position is that. Then A, we have the department's response to the coroner was inadequate and should have clearly set out whether each recommendation had been accepted, to what extent, and any relevant reasoning. Now, did you ever form a view in your time as head of technical policy about the adequacy of the department's response to the coroner?
I don't recall doing so.
Right.
Sorry. Could I think about that a little bit further?
Of course.
Could you repeat the question, please?
Yes. Did you ever form a view in your time as head of technical policy about the adequacy of the department's response to the coroner?
When I had my handover with Mr. Bird, the two elements flowing from the coroner's report that I was made aware of were the general simplification and clarity exercise, and then from Eric Pickle's letter, the work relating to competent persons schemes. I did probe around the scope of those two recommendations on a number of occasions, just to make sure that the scope of what we were doing was correct. And I concluded that we were doing the right things, I thought, in response to those recommendations.
I see. When you say probe around the scope, what do you mean you probed around the scope of those two recommendations?
I think that I checked whether there were any technical changes that needed to be made.
And what was the answer? What were you told?
That it was a simplification exercise and the competent person scheme issue.
So does it follow from that you were told there weren't any technical changes that needed to be made?
That's correct, yeah.
That was your understanding?
In terms of, yeah, as far as I can recall.
And who did you check that with, that was the exercise you had to be engaged in?
There's an email exchange with Brian Martin, which I think you'll be aware of.
I'm coming to that.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I was aware that the department's position was based on the update of ADB 2006 in terms of recommendation 1 and the issue of the guidance from the LGA on flats and their operation. That had been part of the handover discussion. So I did understand that those recommendations were deemed to have been addressed through separate mechanisms.
Yes, I see. And I'll come to that. So I think what you're saying is you were led to believe that the 2006 version of ADB had addressed some of the coroner's concerns, yes?
Yes.
Right. And this idea that the coroner's recommendations were limited to simplification and the competent person scheme, yes? Did it come as a surprise to you when you first read, in fact, what the coroner had been suggesting in the recommendations? When did you first see that?
I don't recall, in all honesty.
Right. Do you remember seeing it at any time prior to leaving the department in 2017? The detail of what she'd actually suggested?
Yes, I'm sure that I did. I just can't recall when that was.
But just to be clear, in your mind, all that the department had committed to was simplification and the competent person scheme. Is that right?
As far as I can recall, those were the two key actions that department. And the review of ADB.
Right, I see. B of these submissions picks up on the point you just made about the 2006 version of ADB, and I'll come back to that. Let's look at C. It says, without having made its position clear in its response, the department should have treated the work to clarify and simplify ADB as an urgent priority, and so should not have decided to fold the work into a broader review expected to take at least another 3 years. Do you accept that acceptance? Do you accept that the department should have treated the work to clarify and simplify ADB as an urgent priority and shouldn't have folded it into a broader review expected to take at least another 3 years? Do you accept that?
No, I think at the time, the need to run these processes in parallel was, to a certain degree, logical. Just because of, at least in part because of the resource constraints and the process constraints involved. In retrospect, I think it would have been, and I would probably have been in a better position if that had been the decision to actually just undertake the simplification exercise as a short project, if that were possible.
Right. Are you saying with hindsight it would have been better to keep those two strands of work separate?
Assuming that the simplification exercise was achievable without going through the full process, which may not be the case, in hindsight, if that would have assisted in providing greater clarity, then yes, of course.
Right. Let's look at D. It says there, subsequent delays to the original timetable should have been highlighted to ministers and led to a reconsideration of whether changes to ADB required more urgent progression. Do you accept that the subsequent delays to the original timetable, I think that's referring to the 2016-2017 commitment to reviewing ADB that was in Mr. Pickles' letter to the coroner, should have been highlighted to ministers, the delays to that, and should have led to a reconsideration of whether changes to ADB required more urgent progression. Do you accept that?
No, I don't accept that. I accepted in the part that, yes, in retrospect, we should have been clearer with ministers about how that was progressing. But actually, the practicalities of moving that forward more quickly were challenging, I think.
Right. And E, it said there, the department missed the opportunity to look beyond the recommendations made by the coroner and consider how widespread the use of non-compliant materials on high-rise buildings was and the associated fire safety risks. Do you accept that?
No, I don't think I do. The events at Lachenal were very specific in terms of external fire spread, as I understand them, and those were taken seriously, and further research was commissioned to look at the issues with spandrel panels and so forth. The environment we worked in was highly constrained. It was very difficult to expand the scope of our activities, and there was constant, I'd say, downward pressure. Maybe no, sorry, that's not the right phrase. It felt it was a very constrained environment in terms of expanding the scope of the work that we did.
When you say the events at Lachenal were very specific, you say that in terms of external fire spread, the events at Lachenal were very specific in terms of external fire spread. What do you mean by that?
My understanding was that in terms of the external fire spread, there was a problem with the spandrel panels to the reglazed windows and how they interacted, and these were the non-compliant elements. And that is a very specific, the confusion was as to whether the panels were part of a wall or a window, in essence, as I understood it. And that seemed a very specific issue that was quite limited. It was about not realising that the regulations applied to an element rather than the regulations actually being in error. Sorry, the approved document or guidance being in error.
Right. Were you ever made aware that there was unusual downward fire spread noted at Lachenal House?
I'm aware of that now, but I wasn't at the time.
Right. When you say research was commissioned in relation to spandrel panels, what are you referring to there?
I believe there was a research report in April delivered by BRE in April 2016, which was some experimental, smallish scale fire research to look at the kind of factors that had been identified at Lachenal in terms of fire spread.
I see. Was that the research carried out by Mr. Crowder?
I believe so, but I couldn't say for sure.
Right.
It was delivered to the reports were delivered to the department in April 2016.
Right. I see. Now, I just want to take each of the recommendations that the coroner made and just ask you in more detail about them. If we look back at the first again, this is at CLG 401870 at page 3. We can see, and we read it before, that what she's asked for in the first bullet is that review ADB to ensure that it provides clear guidance in relation to Regulation B4, with particular regard to the spread of fire over the external envelope of the building and the circumstances in which attention should be paid to whether proposed work might reduce existing fire protection. Now, was it your understanding when you were head of technical policy that this recommendation had been accepted or rejected by the department?
What I understood was that the department's position was that the amendments to ADB 2006 had addressed this recommendation.
And when you say it was the department's position, whose position was that?
It's a good question. Essentially, it flowed from the advice, I guess, that went to the Secretary of State.
And who put that advice together?
It would have been either Anthony Bird or Brian Martin.
Right. So your understanding was that clear advice had been given to the Secretary of State to the effect that recommendation number 1 had been met, fully met by the 2006.
Sorry, I can't. I shouldn't speculate about this. I'm drawing myself into. I understood that that recommendation 1 had been addressed by the ADB 2006 review, and that would have come from my handover discussion with Mr. Bird.
Right. And addressed in its entirety with nothing left for the department to do? Or was it still accepted that there was some work that the department needed to do beyond the 2006 version of ADB?
I don't recall that level of detail, but I do recall that within the simplification plan, I always envisaged that we would return to these factors to make sure that they were suitably clear.
So do you mean that as part of the exercise to try and simplify approved document B, your expectation was that the question of whether it was clear enough would also be grappled with?
I expected us to look at Section 12 and undertake a clarification exercise in the same way that we were doing with the rest of the document.
Right. And when did you expect that that work would be carried out? As part of what project?
That would be part of the simplification work. I think the ADB review, when it was combined, became, I think you'll be well aware, there were difficulties in progressing that for various reasons. It was initially imagined that it would be a combined simplification and technical update. The simplification work was progressing, but it wasn't complete in 2017. And I imagined that the Section 12 would be going through that same process, so it would reach the same level of maturity as the review of the rest of the document.
Right. So the simplification work in relation to external fire spread, when would that be addressed?
It would have been addressed. Clearly, we had problems in progressing that review. It would have been addressed once we had got to the point where we had a working group in place, I would imagine.
Right. So as part of the technical review then?
I think even the simplification work needed external input to ensure that we were clarifying and improving, not.
Right.
Well, yeah, we would seek external input as to whether what we were doing is actually assisting and improving matters.
Right. Now, just going back to what we were looking at, you've told us that you were informed either by Mr. Martin or Mr. Bird that the 2006 version of ADB had addressed the coroner's first concern, yes?
I believe so.
Did you take any steps yourself to satisfy yourself that that was an appropriate line to be taking?
I understood that this had been looked into in depth and in detail, certainly as a result of the department's involvement in the actual inquest. And therefore, I didn't actually challenge or look to amend that position.
Yeah. Does it follow that you didn't ever go to the 2006 edition of ADB yourself to check whether or not, in fact, it had addressed the concerns that we see expressed here by the coroner?
That's correct.
So you never went to the text and looked for yourself and worked out what the changes were?
I don't recall doing so.
Did you have a clear understanding in your own mind of what the changes had been in the 2006 edition of ADB, even in general terms?
I understood that there was a reorganisation of the sections But no, I didn't have a detailed understanding of those changes.
Right. What was Mr. Martin's attitude to the recommendations that had been made by the coroner? Did you get the impression that Mr. Martin was taking her recommendations seriously?
Yes, but I was not involved in those discussions at the point that these decisions on what to take forward were made. So I can't comment on that. But yes, Mr. Martin, I think, absolutely took these matters seriously.
Were you ever in his presence when he was dismissive of the recommendations that had been made by the coroner or seeking to play them down?
I don't recall so.
If we can go back to the department's opening submissions, CLG 3036387, I want to look at paragraph 96 on page 32. And I want to pick it up 4 lines down. There's a sentence that begins, officials agreed. It says, officials agreed that further general improvements could be made to the clarity and presentation of ADB, and the document had already been earmarked for redrafting in accordance with the department's new style guide. But they did not agree that in its 2006 iteration, it was so inaccessible that a competent professional for whom the document was produced would not be able to understand the guidance it provided. This led officials to conclude that there was nothing about recommendation 4 that was safety critical. Do you see that?
Yes, I do.
Now, you were an official at the time, but are you saying that you weren't one of the officials that actually reached this view yourself, that it, such that they didn't agree that in its 2006 iteration it was so inaccessible that a competent professional wouldn't be able to understand the guidance?
I wasn't involved in formulating the position on Lachenal House. So no, basically, I wasn't involved in that.
So is your evidence that effectively the position was set when
Yes.
you came in as head of technical?
That's correct.
And you were just implementing what had already been agreed?
That's correct.
Let's turn to some emails now. If we go to CLG 3018930, this is an email chain between you and Mr. Martin in May 2016. And I want to start at the bottom of page 1 in the third email down. Right at the bottom, there's an email dated the 25th of May at 10:40 a.m. from you to Mr. Martin. And if we go over the page, we can see the content of the email. And we can see, if we look in the third paragraph of this email, you say this, as an aside, I've never quite understood what needed to be sorted out in ADB as a result of Lachenal House. Was it primarily application of requirements to retrofit work, or guidance on surface spread of flame, or perhaps a bit of both? Do you see that?
I do.
Now, we're going to come back, just so you know, we'll come back to this email chain later to discuss some other issues that it raises about workload, etc., and Mr. Martin's workload. But just sticking with the Lachenal House theme. So this is over 2 years since you became head of technical policy in January 2014. We're now in May 2016. Can you explain how you were still unclear about what needed to be sorted out in Approved Document B at this time?
I'm very embarrassed by this email, and I apologise if it's caused any distress or upset. It's a naive email, and it was purposefully written in a naive manner. At the time, there was some tension between myself and Mr. Martin, largely, I think, stemming from my putting pressure on Mr. Martin with regards to the ADB simplification work. I also recall at the time that Mr. Martin was short periods of leave at short notice, and I believe that he was dissatisfied to the point where he was looking for alternative employment. I had probed Mr. Martin on a number of occasions about the scope of the Lachenal recommendations, and I think the intent, when I first probably wrote this, I probably wrote, can I just check that there are no technical changes that are needed to ADB, step flowing from Lachenal House, because time was moving on and the time to meet the coroner's recommendation was, we were progressing through time, and if we needed to make technical changes, I wanted to be absolutely sure that we didn't need to make any more. But because of that tension and not wanting to probe, I wrote a very open, naive email to try to seek a slightly broader conversation about whether there were technical changes that were needed. Yeah, I'm very ashamed of this email exchange.
Are you saying that at the time you were having to couch your language carefully for fear of upsetting Mr. Martin further? Is that what you're saying?
I didn't want to upset him unnecessarily. Yes, that's quite right.
And why would asking whether there are any technical requirements technical changes to ADB that needed to be made following the Lachenal house fire, why would asking that question have inflamed the situation with Mr. Martin?
I don't know if, because I seem to remember I'd probed on these areas before, and this is an email about me trying to manage and retain people within my team in a way. That's the way I felt about it at the time, whilst checking on those processes. And it was meant to just be a more gentle way of sense checking that there weren't technical changes that were needed.
Yeah. Now, you said you'd probed Mr. Martin on a number of occasions about the scope of the recommendations before this, yes?
Well, I remember conversations where we'd kind of gone over, I think, what was needed and what was necessary, yeah.
And what was it about those conversations that hadn't given you the information you needed?
I felt I did have. It was pretty clear from those conversations what Mr. Martin believed we had committed to doing. That was not unclear. This is just a clumsy way of trying to open a conversation to sense check that there weren't technical changes that were going to be difficult to achieve before the committed deadline for delivery.
Yeah. So is the reality that at this point you did have some doubts in the back of your mind about whether or not there was more that did need to be done?
No, I just wanted to know. I just wanted to open that conversation and know that I just wanted to make absolutely sure that we weren't thinking that there were technical changes that needed to be made to ADB.
Yes, but is that because you hadn't had a clear answer previously about whether there were technical changes that needed to be made to ADB?
No, it was because I was mindful that time was moving on. We weren't managing to progress matters as quickly as we had planned, and it was purely about not running out. It was, if we needed to make technical changes, then that was going to be extremely difficult. I still felt simplification work was deliverable.
Were you nervous about challenging Mr. Martin because the division couldn't afford to lose him?
I didn't want to incentivize or make a situation worse when I felt we didn't need to. But I didn't worry about challenging Mr. Martin. We did have our disagreements. It just didn't seem to me that... I just thought this was a way of opening that conversation that was a bit more sensitive.
Yeah. But either way, I mean, even if you were having to be careful here, and even if this was just something you were trying to tick off your worry list, if you like, we'll come to another worry list later, but wasn't this very late in the day to be checking whether there were technical changes that needed to be made to approved document B arising from Lachenal House?
It was. I felt clear in my mind that we were looking at a simplification exercise primarily, allied with, by this stage things were getting difficult with the technical review, but I was clear about that. I just wanted to check, and it's a clumsy way of checking.
Did you ever ask Mr. Martin to prepare you a short briefing document explaining what the coroner's concerns had been at the Lachenal House inquest, so you could have a very clear understanding of what the problems had been that we saw that then she referred to in her letter? Did you ever ask him to prepare that document?
No, I didn't.
Why not? Wasn't that an obvious thing to ask him to do, so that you had a very clear understanding of where you stood?
I was quite clear from the handover in 2014 what the task was that we were meant to do, flowing from the letter, the Rule 43 letter, when the handover happened. But I was just mindful. I just wanted to check that there was that was right. It was purely about looking at the. We'll come on to the programme for the ADB review at some stage, but it was looking at where we were in that timescale and just wanting to be absolutely sure that we weren't missing something.
But do you accept this was very late in the day to be doing that? You're 2 years on in your role as head of technical policy, and you're into mid-2016 now.
But it's about the progress of, from my perspective at that moment in time, it's about the progress in time. I was clear about what I'd been tasked to deliver, and I just wanted to make sure that there was nothing missing from that.
I see. Was your failure to get on top of this issue in the first 2 years in post a result of the low priority which the department was giving to the review of ADB and any action to implement the coroner's recommendations?
Pretty much the entire division's work were distorted from 2014 to almost mid-2015 by the housing standards review work that we were doing. And that, given the delivery deadlines for the research supporting the technical ADB review, created some delay, but it definitely delayed the work looking at simplification.
Right.
We didn't have the capacity to carry that simplification work forward at the same time as delivering the measures that were required by the Housing Standards Review.
Was that ever clearly spelt out to ministers? Did you ever say to ministers in a submission, the Housing Standards Review work is so all-encompassing that we are not going to be able to progress any work, including the simplification work arising from Lachenal House, because of it?
No, but at the time that it was going on. So I'm going to unpack a little bit around that, if that's okay. So when the Housing Standards Review, in 2014, the Housing Standards Review was meant to deliver in October 2014. The research reports were due to be delivered at the earliest at the end of 2014, kind of first quarter 2015, to underpin the technical review. The simplification exercise was a less onerous exercise in some respects than the technical review. And so there's a kind of slippage of two timescales across each other in this space, whereby actually what's happening here is that I'm starting to get concerned that we can't deliver the technical review whilst I still believe we can deliver the simplified document as part of that process.
Right, I see. So is your evidence that the time slipped with both of them, and so there wasn't an opportunity in which you could spell out to ministers that one particular work strand was directly impacting on the other?
I mean, I think in retrospect, we should have absolutely had a tracker on this, and we should have had much better program management, but we didn't have anyone to do it. We didn't have any resources within the team deployed to manage programs. So it was largely down to the policy leads or myself to try and look at timescales. We should have, I think, been much clearer, but in all honesty, I don't know that we were... The problems we were experiencing with delays around this time were pretty much unprecedented, and we were struggling to deal with what was going to happen and what was happening in terms of those timescales. So I don't think at this point I had absolute clarity about some of these issues.
Right. Yeah.
It was a matter of making best efforts, and this was part of it. This was an inquiry to try and make sure that there really wasn't something that did need to be flagged,
Right.
I guess.
Let's look at Mr. Martin's response to you. If we go further up the email chain, on page 1, the second email down is dated the 26th of May 2016 at 8:06. And he says, again, we'll come back to this email in the context of his workload later. You can see in the penultimate paragraph, he says, the commitment following Lachenal House was a general simplification one. More important was a look at replacement window, CP, competent person schemes. We're trying again to address the CP schemes. Do you see that there?
I do.
What did you understand him to mean by the commitment following Lachenal House was a general simplification one?
This is recommendation 2 from the coroner's letter with regards to improving the clarity and legibility and understandability of ADB.
Right, and at the time you got this email, did you understand it to mean the second recommendation by the coroner?
That was my understanding, yes.
Right. And did you ever go back to the coroner's letter and check the recommendations she'd made and the commitment that the department had made following it?
I don't recall doing so.
Now, you reply to Mr. Martin, if we go to the top of the chain, we can see you're dealing with this in the second paragraph down. So this is the 27th of May 2016. You say, let's also work out what REBA E can do. Who are you referring to there?
RIBA Enterprises.
Yeah.
They were the publisher of the approved documents.
Yeah. And the Manual of Building Control may help if post-Lachenal questions were about which requirements apply, ? I think you might also want to ask Nick to look at the ADs for brevity, never known a man more concise. Let me know if you need help with the GGF and /CPS, etc. Do you see that there?
I do.
Now, Brian Martin had written that the commitment was a general simplification one. Why did you reply saying the Manual of Building Control may help if post-Lachenal questions were about which requirements apply?
This was about the complexity of the building regulations. It was about whether the trigger points for application of different parts of the building regulations in the regulations were not clearly understood, which might have contributed to the spandrel panels not meeting the requirements for a wall rather than being considered as part of a window. So it's really about saying, let's look at the manual for building control that we're trying to draft, and if there are opportunities to provide greater clarity in that document as to legal application or limits of application or whatever it may be, then we should do that.
Right. But can you see that you're potentially talking at cross purposes? He's merely talking about simplification. You're talking about clarification as to which requirements apply. Aren't those potentially different things?
Well, it wouldn't be a legal change. It would be a clarification in another document as to how those mechanisms worked.
Right, but I don't think that answers my question. He seems to be talking about simplification, and you're talking about clarification as to which requirements apply. Did you think that simplification and clarification were synonymous at the time?
I mean, these are two different projects, and I'm just trying to link them up to best effect. If there's any way that we can use the manual to address, for instance, some of the issues that maybe the competent person schemes or others were having in understanding what they needed to do.
Right. See, what we don't see is a very clear document or email setting out exactly what you thought this clarification work or simplification work involved, do we?
No.
And can you explain why you didn't get that from Mr. Martin, why you didn't pin him down at this point and say, hang on, stop, we've got to be very clear exactly what we're talking about in terms of simplification or clarification and exactly what bits of the guidance we're talking about? Why wasn't that ever done in this period?
Mr. Martin's reply had confirmed the position that I understood. There was a process for the simplification exercise in terms of looking at how to improve the clarity of ADB, although, as I say, this is still conjoined with a technical review to a degree at this point. So that process was just going to continue as far as I was concerned, because we didn't seem to need to change direction.
Right. Now let's go back to the coroner's second recommendation, CLG 401870, page 3. This was to ensure that ADB is expressed in words and adopts a format which are intelligible to the wide range of people and bodies engaged in construction, maintenance and refurbishment of buildings, and not just the professionals who may already have a depth of knowledge of building regulations and building control matters. Was it your understanding that that recommendation was accepted or rejected?
Yeah, I think it was partially accepted, i.e. that there should be a clearer document. But I understand that the view was that there was a limit to the extent that you could remove the technical nature of the language involved in approved document B. i.e., there were limits as to how practical it was to write a statutory guidance document that was accessible to everyone working across the entire maintenance chain, as well as other it's about how far you can go in reducing the technical complexity of the guidance.
Right.
That there's a limit to what you can do, and I understood that had been the point made in Secretary of State's reply, I think.
Right. Let's look at Eric Pickles' response to the coroner on the 20th of May 2013, CLG 402788. This is his response to her, and if we go to page 2 and look at the last two paragraphs, we see a response in relation to the building regulations. And we can see he says, finally, in relation to building regulations, I've noted your concerns about the difficulties that some of those involved in the inquest had with the interpretation of approved document B. I can assure you that my department is committed to a programme of simplification. However, the design of fire protection in buildings is a complex subject and should remain to some extent in the realm of professionals. Then it goes on, we have commissioned research which will feed into a future review of this part of the building regulations. We expect this work to form the basis of a formal review leading to the publication of a new edition of the approved document in 2016-2017. The revision will be drafted in accordance with a new style guide for approved documents aimed at ensuring the guidance is capable of being more easily understood and that the need to cross-reference is reduced. Now, just going back and looking at the first of those paragraphs, it's written, I can assure you that my department is committed to a programme of simplification. That's the second sentence of that penultimate paragraph. Can we agree now that the coroner was not looking for simplification but for clarity and an intelligible format and language, wasn't she?
That's correct. But in our terms, the simplification exercise covered those issues. So the new formats, plain English edits, taking this through a process to assess how to improve workflow and understanding, they were all part of the simplification work that we were planning to do.
I see. If we look at the final sentence of that paragraph, where it says, however, the design of fire protection in buildings is a complex subject and should remain to some extent in the realm of professionals. Do you know, were you ever told what professionals were being referred to there?
No, but I took the clarity and simplification work very seriously. I'd driven that very hard across not just ADB, but across all of the approved documents to develop better consistency and deliver better outputs. I guess what I'm saying is that to the extent that it was possible, I was genuinely passionate about improving the usability of the approved documents as far as possible. So these were, the last line of that letter, again, I wasn't involved in drafting the letter. I thought that there were important opportunities to improve outcomes more broadly, and I was driving those a lot harder than I think would have been imagined when this letter was written in, I think it's 2013, isn't it?
I see. So are you saying that when you picked this project up, you think you took it more seriously than perhaps your predecessors had been taking it?
No, I think that I expanded the scope, tried to expand the scope of what we were doing, and that includes things like the manual to the building regulations, which would have provided, a better procedural guide to help people achieve the right outcomes, and more consistency across. I took more consistency across the statutory guidance also. These seem like kind of small iterative changes, but the approved documents were somewhat incoherent by this stage. They had at least 4 different introductory front ends with different descriptions in that were increasingly out of date. The structure and the format of the guidance, these were all not consistent, and across the piece that made it much more difficult for people to go from one document to another document or to understand how the consistency of the system was meant to work. So this was, I think what I'm trying to say is that I thought I was probably being more ambitious about the overall improvement we could get in compliance and outcomes from that process than had been imagined at this point.
I see. But going back to the statement there that this is a complex subject, should remain to some extent in the realm of professionals, did those professionals include, for example, architects, cladding designers, building control officers?
I wasn't involved in the statement, but I am absolutely sure that it referred to construction sector professionals.
Right. Were you ever told that one of the experts that was appointed by the coroner to the Lachenal House Inquest, Mr. David Walker, had managed to get pretty confused about whether certain requirements applied to the external wall of the building? Were you ever told that?
No.
Were you ever told, so you weren't told what his qualifications were, and that it was perhaps surprising that someone in his position was able to get so confused? You were never fed, that was never fed back to you?
No.
Wasn't that the problem with never getting a proper readout about what had actually happened at Lachenal House, so that you had a very clear picture of what the problems were that you were seeking to address?
I accept and I wish that I had looked in more depth, but the commission I was given in 2014 was quite specific, and we were having trouble driving that forward as it was. But I think the internal processes within the department and within the division were heavily driven by correspondence documents and records rather than developing internal reports. It was part of a kind of culture which was really about expediency because of, in my view, inadequate resourcing.
Right. Is that shorthand for saying there simply wouldn't have been time for somebody to sit down and spend some time capturing the problems that were encountered at Lachenal, the difficulties the coroner had in interpreting the guidance herself, the difficulty the experts had in interpreting the guidance, so that the full context to her recommendations were understood? Are you saying there simply wasn't time to do that?
I'm saying that culturally, if you tried to take that approach across all of the issues that the division was looking at, it was completely unsupportable. The scope of the work that we were involved with is very large. It is complex. There were a great number of issues that were coming up. And I think this was true of many aspects of what we were doing. The way that we worked had been squeezed to fit the resource rather than matched to a robust set of processes to manage issues like this. There was no protocol within the department for how to record or deal with coroner's recommendations. It sat within the policy lead's responsibilities, and it was their job to either hand that on or to actually deliver against those. And I know this may sound very strange, but this is the civil certainly within our division, and I think probably more widely, the kind of process side is often very weak because it has been thinned out to allow resources to be delivered to other priorities. In the case of our division, the process for amending or changing regulation was becoming so onerous that we were working hand to mouth to try and cover the scope and the ground that we needed to. I appreciate and I wish that I had done that, but we had been squeezed so much that we were literally, the only way we could keep up with what was going on was this very light touch approach to reviewing and considering. You had to keep making decisions and because if you start, we were struggling to deal with the scope of the portfolios that we had, and this is symptomatic of that.
Right. Okay. I want to ask you some questions now about the competent person scheme. If we go over to page 3 of Eric Pickles' letter, we can see that it says, in the meantime, however, I've commissioned my officials to review the current guidance issued by providers of competent person schemes for window installers. The review is intended to ensure that members of these schemes are fully aware of the scope of these schemes and the fire safety measures which should be addressed, and is, I believe, an appropriate response to the problems that came to light during the inquests. You see that there?
Yeah.
Now, if we look at your witness statement, page 12, paragraph 39, and I want to pick it up, it's kind of 8 lines down. In the middle of the line, there's a sentence beginning, "My understanding is that." Do you have that?
Yes, I do.
And you say, "My understanding is that whilst the coroner's report focused on the need for an approved document B review, the view of officials was that work to improve internal procedures and the competent person scheme was at least equally important because unless the requirements in guidance were adequately communicated to operatives via the competent person scheme, then quality of compliance could be affected." Now, this wasn't an issue that the coroner had raised at all, was it?
No, not to the best of my knowledge, no.
Did you understand that at the time, that she hadn't actually raised the competence person scheme?
Yeah, I think I did, yeah.
Yeah. When you say that it was your understanding that the view of officials was that work on the competent person scheme was at least equally important, which officials are you referring to?
I think both Anthony Bird and Brian Martin.
Right. And on what basis did those officials hold the view that that work was equally as important as work on the approved document itself?
Well, these are my words. I can't actually, I think I've probably overstated in my witness statement by accident. The point that was being made was that to address the root cause, if the competent person schemes were not actually operating effectively, then changing the guidance in the approved document would be changing the guidance or simplifying guidance in the approved document would actually be irrelevant if they were not actually operating in a way which ensured they understood what they needed to do to comply with Part B.
Yes, I understand it's a potential problem if that guidance isn't being communicated properly to those who are actually carrying out the work, but isn't the primary consideration making sure that the guidance itself is actually clear?
Yes, it's necessary for the guidance to be clear, but if people don't refer to the guidance or know that they need to apply it, then that is at least as problematic, I would have thought.
Right. Can we go to an email on this topic? CLG 402792. This is an email sent by Mr. Martin to Anthea Nicholson within the department,
Yeah.
and others, and copying you in. Do you see that?
Yes.
Who was Miss Nicholson and the others that we see copied there?
Anthea Nicholson was a grade 7 working in, and I should explain this, responsibility for the legislation, so the Building Act and the building regulations, for oversight of competent person schemes, oversight of the building control system, oversight of building control bodies, sat within a separate team within the division. Anthea Nicholson was a grade 7 working in that team, and at the time, I believe, was leading on looking at competent person scheme issues. Ian Drummond was the grade 7 in charge of the system as a whole, legislation, the other factors I've mentioned. Alison Lockyer was, I think, an HEO or an SEO supporting them.
Fine, okay. Now, we can see that Mr. Martin says all, and we can see the subject is findings of a review of replacement window scheme guidance following the Lachenal House inquest. He says all. Further to this, I've drafted the attached letter back to the CP scheme providers, competent person scheme providers, comments please. And then he says this, plan is to stir them up and see if they can't work it all out for themselves. Do you see that?
Yeah.
Now, does that accurately sum up what the department was doing? Stir them up and see if they can't work it all out for themselves?
the point is that the onus was on the competent person schemes to address the defaults in their actual schemes. We didn't own the schemes, but we might have oversight of them. Therefore, what's being suggested is that we set them a task to resolve the difficulties that they have within their own systems.
Right. So it sounds like that Mr. Martin's summary was a fair summary of the plan. Try and get them to take it upon themselves to provide better guidance, yes?
Yes, and again, you've got to remember that we're working within a policy environment where actual regulatory intervention has to be the last resort. There was a presumption that you start with industry taking responsibility and acting for itself and then work through to regulation if that's what you needed to do, and that's what Mr. Martin, he's basically saying put a lot of pressure on them to go and address these issues.
Right. And can you help us, was that work on the competent person schemes ever completed, so far as you understood?
I think there were delays. It was hard work getting the competent person schemes to resolve those issues, as far as I remember, and I don't believe it actually reached a conclusion.
No, and that does seem to be consistent with Mr. Martin's evidence. For the transcript, that's at paragraph 35, page 13 of his statement. Now, the final recommendation of the coroner, if we go back to her letter, CLG 401870, page 3, was to review ADB to ensure that it provides guidance which is of assistance to those involved in maintenance or refurbishment of older housing stock, and not only those engaged in design and construction of new buildings. Now, can you help us? Was this recommendation accepted or rejected, so far as you understood?
It was believed to have been addressed by the issue of the LGA's guidance on purpose-built flats. So rather than having guidance on this matter in ADB, it was the LGA's purpose-built flats guidance, which had been, I think, joint funded by the department.
Right, and who told you that? Who told you that this recommendation had been addressed by the issue of the LGA's guidance on purpose-built blocks of flats?
I would imagine it was part of the handover process that I had.
Right, so as far as you were concerned, that was not a recommendation that you were taking forward when you were head of technical policy?
No.
Now, let's turn to an email now, CLG 50634. This is an email from Anthony Bird to you and various other officials, including Mr. Martin, on the 11th of July 2013. The email confirms, we can see it from the title, the subject, our meeting today at 2 p.m. to discuss 2016-17 review. Do you see that?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I do.
And if the email itself, it says, chaps, we're due to sit down together at 2 p.m. today to discuss the potential scope of the 2016-17 technical review. Can I therefore suggest 2 items for discussion? Update on the CPR and potential impacts for current approved documents and any future technical reviews. And 2, what technical parts of the regulations should be included in any 2016 review and why? Obviously, ministers have already shown their hand on Part B following Lachenal House. And it goes on, etc. Do you see that?
I do.
Now, did you attend that meeting?
I assume that I did, but I don't recall the meeting.
Can you help us as to what particular issues were discussed about approved document B and which parts of that would be included in the 2016-2017 review?
No, I have no recollection that can assist you, I'm afraid.
If we could go to another email, CLG 30189117. What we can see in this email chain is that on the 4th of February 2014, in the second email down, you forward an email chain to Brian Martin and Mr. Leadsom, and you ask, if you go to the second paragraph, so the paragraph beginning, how does this align? In the second sentence, you say, do we have ministerial agreement to implement the ADB review? If not, then statements in the sub need to be suitably qualified. And then we can see, going up to the top of the chain on page 1, that Mr. Martin responds on the 4th of February. In the last paragraph, so he quotes from Mr. Pickles' letter, and then in the last paragraph he says, we've repeated this line a couple of times since. It's also in Brandon Lewis's speech for Thursday. It's not an absolute commitment. Do you see that?
I do.
Now, when you received that email, what did you understand Mr. Martin to mean by that? It's not an absolute commitment.
That the scope of the ADB review would still be subject to further approvals, I imagine. I mean, I don't recall what I thought at the time, but I looking at that, there are still clearance processes that you will go through as you develop the policy. And of course, that deadline would shift across administrations. So there would be a process of, although I don't think it would have happened, there would be a process of making a new administration aware of that commitment.
I see. I mean, you tell us in your statement, we don't need to go to it, paragraph 103, page 27, that you were fully aware of the commitment after Lachenal House. Did you understand it to be a provisional commitment?
No, it was a commitment to undertake that work, but there are always kind of further qualifications as you go through the process. If we had gone to ministers with an enormous programme of regulation, they would have had the right to make a further decision on that. And the scope of the technical part of the review, I think, I'm not sure, but I think the scope of that review was still to be determined at this point.
I see. So you say, no, it was a commitment to undertake that work. So it was a firm commitment as far as you understood it?
Everything is transient when you go across certain boundaries. But yes, the intent and the commitment was absolutely sincere, but it doesn't mean that we wouldn't need to get further ministerial approvals for the way that was taken forward. I think this is very much about the technical part of the review and the work that was to address recommendation 2 being conjoined. The technical review would still always need to requalify the scope at a future point. So it's not that we have carte blanche to do anything we want, I think.
Isn't the key to this the use of the word we expect? And what he's saying is we expect this to, what the line is, we expect this to be part of the formal review, but it's not a commitment. It's a way of giving comfort to the recipient without formally giving some form of undertaking, isn't it?
I entirely accept your point. I didn't read it in that way at the time. But
Well,
I
There may be other ways of reading it, if it's just how it struck me, that's all.
Yeah, I mean, my understanding was that we would need to sense check that commitment as time went on, but it wasn't that the commitment wasn't sincere at that time.
But if that's right, isn't that a statement of the obvious that, then, for example, there might be changes in administration? Why? Isn't that an odd thing? If that's what he meant, isn't that quite an odd thing for him to be saying?
New administrations always have the opportunity to change the decisions of the previous administration.
Yeah, and what I'm saying is that's obvious. Why he wouldn't need to spell that out to you?
I'm I'm talking about, well, this was my understanding at the time. I can't absolutely definitively say what Mr. Martin meant by that.
Okay. Perhaps we can look at one more email before we break. CLG 50707. There's a third email down in this chain is from you to Mr. Leadsom and Mr. Martin on the 12th of October 2016 at 13:52. And you say, this is about approved document B, in the second paragraph, it would be useful to have a recap on commitments made by the Secretary of State on Part B following Lachenal House. Specifically, what were the complaints levied? And to what extent are we seeking to address them through our proposed review programme? Once a meeting date is arranged, we should also set aside 45 minutes for a pre-meet to cover this. Do you see that?
Yes.
Now, only 5 months before, we saw in May 2016, you'd been asking Mr. Martin about this very same topic. We've discussed that in detail. Can you explain why in October 2016 you still appear to be unclear about the commitments made in response to the Lachenal incident and to the extent to which your proposed review was addressing them?
This is a personal, absolutely normal request to have the right information and papers to hand when going into a meeting with another department. I worked across a very large portfolio, and asking for the information to be re-provided is perfectly normal, I think.
But isn't it symptomatic of the fact that you hadn't ever been given a clear statement of what the complaints were that were levied and what you actually were seeking to address through your proposed new programme? Isn't that the truth?
No, I don't accept that. It's just making sure that it's not. What I think I was driving at was the information shouldn't just be what we committed to. It's actually also, I also wanted information on the actual. I wanted all of the other information in relation to what the problems were to hand. That's what it is.
But can we agree if you'd asked for a clear briefing document from Mr. Martin earlier, setting that out, you wouldn't need to be asking this question again in October 2016, would you?
I would still be asking for papers again, to be honest. If I'm going into a meeting with the Home Office or another department and I haven't, I would engage with these areas of work as and when was necessary. It's very periodic. The span of work that I'm doing at that time imposes a big mental workload, and I just want the information refreshed so that I have it all to hand when that meeting happens.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, is that a good moment?
Yes.
Sorry, I've gone slightly over.
That's all right.
Let's start again.
Make an adjustment as we need to.
Thank you.
Mr. Harral, we've got to the stage when we ought to have a break now for everyone to have some lunch. So we'll stop now. We'll resume at 2:05, please. And again, when you're out of the room, please don't talk to anyone about your evidence or anything relating to it.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. 2:05, please. Yep.